So for this next session, starting in just 1 minute, Professor Lucas Kwong will be your moderator. All of the panelists currently here have been promoted. You should have the ability to share your screen and your video. Please let us know if you do not. And currently, I believe one member of this session has not yet logged in, so we may have additional time that we can fill in. But I will communicate with you in the chat, Lucas, if that person appears. Okay, Lucas, whenever you're ready.
Sounds good. Hi, everybody. My name is Lucas Kwong. I'm an associate professor of English at City Tech, and I'm very happy to be introducing this second paper session. So if you were present for the first session, you'll know this, but just in case for newcomers, I will be introducing each speaker in turn, and after that, each speaker will deliver their talk. And then we're going to open the floor for discussion. You can chat with anybody, both panelists and attendees, by using chat at the bottom of the screen, or you can pose observations or questions by clicking on Q&A. You can also click raise hand during the Q&A, but the chat Q&A feature is preferred, since it can be difficult for us to catch raised hands on the participants list. So without further ado, let's get started. Our first presenter is Alicia Matheny Beeson, Assistant Professor of English at West Virginia University at Parkersburg, and she'll be presenting on considering the intersections of class and gender through Utopia.
Thank you very much. So I'll go ahead and begin. Many utopian women writers at the turn of the century explore how women's status related to marriage, motherhood, and work intersect with their class. They often describe female protagonists who successfully undertake profitable and satisfying work, while also maintaining or developing a romantic relationship that sometimes leads to having children. Their movement into the workforce can raise questions about who would care for the home. Utopian texts often address these issues by explaining new methods of domestic labor and childcare that are more communal and thus lessen women's home-related workload. For instance, in Lena Jane Fry's self-published Other Worlds, a story concerning the wealth earned by American citizens and showing how it can be secured to them instead of to the trusts, which was published in 1905, she writes from her experiences as an overwhelmed mother with an absent husband who is critical of monopolies that increase difficulties on everyday people. Her novel depicts an antitrust society established by the Vivian family that builds and shares wealth amongst the community. Individuals who express interest in childcare receive extensive training for the position, transferring the responsibility from families to professionals. The novel highlights the fragile status of women and mothers in a capitalist society, thus highlighting the intersection of gender and class, as well as the need for systematic communal support. Fry's novel contributes to the field of utopian literature by American women in the early 20th century, including others that speak to the challenges of capitalism, childcare, and women's work. Though Fry's novel differs in several key aspects. Other Worlds focuses on a family rather than a female protagonist, emphasizing the impact of a changed society on men and women of various ages. Additionally, it creates a wider societal change initiated by a small group, rather than a small community change or the impact of a societal system already created within the novel's world. Additionally, Fry's explicit attempt at the close of the publication to recruit her readers to help her build a wealth-producing and distributing society in our reality differentiates it from other utopian works of the time. Otherworlds is perhaps the only known work of its kind fully self-published by the author, unless the works published in Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Forerunner are counted as such within the era at the turn of the century. Fry's work to self-publish the novel and the attempt to recruit members indicate her determination and conviction to publish her ideas that work against trust and ultimately aim to benefit families, especially mothers. Through the narrative, Fry highlights the increased possibilities of women associated with the society, as well as the risks for women if they exist outside of it through the Vivian sisters. Scorus Vivian plays a critical role in the new society's creation. Additionally, Scorus, along with her sister Helen, work for their own income. Scorus is an artist employed by an illustrating firm, and her sister Helen had a position in a large department store. They lived together in the flat they had shared with their brother Tom before his marriage and balanced their jobs with aiding the colony through gardening interests in the city. Even when they eventually moved to the newly developed community, they do not stop working. Scorus still did drawings for illustrations, and Helen was doing well at writing for magazines and the society paper. They prioritized their work, focus on ways to assist their surrounding community, and remain open to romantic possibilities. Passionate, skilled, and hardworking, Helen and Scorus align with the new woman of the progressive era. Fry celebrates this new type of womanhood, demonstrating how it can be transformative for not only a woman's socioeconomic status and her sense of self, but also the surrounding community. The Otherworld's character most critical to the discussions of the economic hardships on women is Mira, whose marriage demonstrates some of the institution's worst potential outcomes. When she is 16, Jack Moberly lures Mira away from her family, who served as a source of emotional and financial stability. 6 years pass, Myra bears 3 children, and Jack has become bloated and reckless with drink. Mira's domestic and motherly responsibilities increasingly overwhelm her. Twice, Mira receives assistance from strangers when she was most in need, but her situation remains the same, suggesting that charity and kindness from individuals is not enough. Mira needs a revised societal system that offers more continuous, substantial support. Through Mira's situation, Fry argues that a community like the colony, who distributes its resources and supports its members in a myriad of ways, is just what Mira requires. Mira decides to take her and her children to a nearby colony, a branch of her family's society over 2,000 miles away from where they initially started their alternative society. The narrator's descriptions of the misery and helplessness she experienced on her own are sharply juxtaposed with her life in the colony, where she lives comfortably among green fields and is free to earn a living. Her children are in a much better position because the 2-year-old stays in the nursery and the other children attend boarding school. She can attend to her business while her children receive premium care and support from professionals employed by the colony. And she sees them when she's not working, but they don't reside in the same home. And so that system was controversial at the time and probably still today, but Fry argues that the system is a benefit to all. Mira eventually leaves to join her own family and their colony. The sisters commit to economically support the children into adulthood, and the broader community of the society offers resources for the family's well-being. Through this narrative, Fry asserts that a community with systemic support for childcare and other needs, combined with the help of family, creates an ideal scenario for women's flourishment. The colony is in part a utopia because it provides options for careers, housing, and more that suit each member. The society resists the assumption that the female adult is solely responsible for purchasing the food, preparing meals, and cleaning the kitchen. Instead, the family can choose between preparing meals in their own apartment, cooking food in a shared kitchen, or obtaining already prepared meals from the cook. Not surprisingly, most choose the last option because it offers convenient, well-prepared food. So there's a division of labor to people who are professionalized in each of those fields, which is an idea that Gilman was a proponent of at this time as well. Fry presents her version of an ideal society that provides families with options for their domestic circumstances, including services that lessen the workload, particularly for women. The society also bestows gender-neutral honors and titles on its citizens that they maintain even after marriage, and they could choose if they wanted to keep their own name, create a combination of last names, or take one person's last name. All of these freedoms in turn impacted their romantic relationships. Fry argues that if women can be economically self-sufficient, they can marry purely for love, further contributing to their overall well-being and the common good. Fry demonstrates her desire to implement her ideas in early 20th century America when she encourages her readers to write to her. At the end of the text, she includes a notice that explains, quote, "There are a number of people in Chicago who are about forming a wealth-producing and distributing society," end quote. She invites anyone wishing to join them or learn the particulars concerning said society to write to her address, which she provides. Though information about any attempts at colony creation have not been uncovered, an article about Mrs. Lena Fry, published in the Chicago Daily Tribune in 1913, 7 years after the novel's publication, suggests that the society did not successfully launch because she is living alone in a bleak setting. However, her notice reveals that she does not just want to present a fictional tale about an alternative world, but actually establish a society in Chicago, making it distinct from other utopian texts. She was so passionate about the topic that she decided to self-publish the novel, and though the book's main purpose is the propagandist argument about an alternative society, couching it in novel form softens the radical suggestions and humanizes the political ideas by showing how they impact individual characters. Through Fry's descriptions of characters from diverse backgrounds and various ages, readers can likely relate to someone in the story who benefits from the society. The closing note demonstrates that Fry explicitly intended her novel to persuade readers to help her build an antitrust society. Through this recruitment attempt, Fry uniquely attempts to bridge the gap between utopian literature and utopian practice. Lyman Tower Sargent says there are 3 faces of utopianism: utopian literature, utopian practice, such as intentional communities of the 19th century like Fruitlands and the Oneida Community, and utopian social theory. Fry contributes to this genre through her vision of a colony system that originates with one family and grows into communities across the nation that provide social and economic support for its members, especially women and mothers. And for Fry, that was largely to counter the actions of trusts. However, Fry did not want her colony concept to reside only in the thought experiment of a novel. Rather, she wanted to create the better future by immediately establishing a community with other interested individuals, thus blending these spaces of utopia. Lena Jane Fry's Other Worlds describes a society that profits everyone, not only economically, but also personally and socially. Though the antitrust propagandist argument dominates Fry's novel, her society also considers ways to revise domestic life and childcare, encouraging more communal systems of support. Fry argues that women's experiences, especially as wives and mothers, intersect with their economic security, and her novel proposes alternatives that offer more support and flexibility for women. This novel offers a critical contribution to the utopian works of the era, attempting to offer a scalable model for more supportive, integrated communities that could be initiated by a small group of people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that was a really thought-provoking presentation about the potential for utopia. And we're going to continue talking about this topic with our next few presenters. So next we have Professor Shrishti Chakraborti, scholar from the Department of English at the University of Delhi, as well as an educator at the Heritage School, where she teaches English literature to high school learners. And she's here to discuss her paper, Transforming Fiction, the Cultural Pitfalls of Patriarchy and Gender Subjectivity in Sowmya Rajendran's Dystopia, the Lesson.
Good evening. It's evening here, so just give me a minute before I share my screen. I hope I'm just wondering if you can see it. Okay. So the title of my paper is Transforming Fiction, Cultural Pitfalls of Patriarchy and Gender Subjectivity in Sowmya Rajendran's Dystopia called the lesson. So shifting the lens a little bit from Utopia to Dystopia, this is a recent text and it's published in 2015. And under the assumption that not many have read it, I'm just going to go over the narrative premise of this text a little bit. So this is the cover of the text, where the quote is "Big Brother is watching you still," and it's a very understanding cover of the nature of the text. To note the characters in the text, they are the second daughter, the rapist, the Adjustment Bureau, moral police, and the dupatta regulator. So, for those who do not know what dupatta is it's a very culturally quoted piece of clothing. Mostly people from South Asia wear it. It's sort of like a piece of clothing that you wear over your suit, and it's sort of a modesty regulator for to look modest in front of people. Although it is now transformed into a fashionable item, but for the basis of this term was to control or be modest in front of society. To note that the characters here are not named, none of the characters have names, they're only shared basis on their functionality and the relationships in the text. The major issue happens with respect to when the second daughter of a particular family rebels against the society that is established there, right? Um, Now, what happens in the lesson, to just give a brief overview, it's basically an Orwellian state, and there's an omniscient narrator that talks about the state that is under complete surveillance, but the government policies and police forces, they operate on very, very misogynist rules to control men and women, right? To notify, as you can see, the title of the rapist there is a government high position whose job is to uh, give lessons to people women who are asking for it or need discipline actions for floundering the rules set by the government, right? There are adjustment bureaus and moral police who form like the ideological and repressive state apparatus to sort of continue this hegemony of misogynist world, right? Um, Everybody follows a particular conduct book which talks or dictates how women are supposed to behave, right? And there aren't any vehement incidents of female feticide or infanticide in the novel. However, the entirety of the novel and the misogyny functions on this idea of holy institution of marriage, where females are obligated to be married by a marriageable notifier, and they start off as gentle reminders, but they get more insistent as time passes and even becomes punishable if you don't follow it, right? Although divorce by law is allowed in this particular society, but nobody ever gets it. Now, the main problem happens when the second daughter demands divorce from her very abusive husband and family, and they use biotechnology and futuristic technology to sort of ask women to quote adjust even after cases for violence and marital rape, right? There is in the story, you see the second daughter walk up to the adjustment bureau, the head, and to say that I want a divorce, and they put her in this prison of illusion, which is basically ask it alters the mind to basically adjust to this state of affair. And what the conflict of the story is that none of those things work on the second daughter because she's so adamant to move away from this particular structure, right? Um, Now, what happens? It doesn't. Uh, the main narrative begins when the second order doesn't fall for any of these traps set by the government. And it's a rampant showcasing of violence against women that is sort of normalized in this world where there is the moral police and who polices the women, random women, by throwing themselves on her in an act of punishment, right? It's a satiric, dystopic satire on the very, very voyeuristic nature of people who use media and technology to sort of look at television channels that thrive on shows which cure quote unquote unnatural sexuality, which is basically referring to the LGBTQ plus community. And they decide, the story happens that why the cover is the way that it is, that the story works on the penultimate episode on how the disobedience of the second daughter is transformed into this television show where the climax of that particular 22 episode television show is the rapist performing the lesson on the second daughter in front of the public, right? Now, I believe like the idea of Indian speculative writing with respect to something as very striking as this book is that it doesn't happen out of nowhere. And even though speculative writing in India has been very, very prolific over in past and in present, but the kind of novels that the authors like Sowmya Rajendran are writing at this point of time is very different from the novels that or the kind of act of writing that has existed in India, essentially because it has had a tradition of narrative premise being taken from the mythological. So two very, very popular mythological, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. So you have different authors talking about different reinterpretations of that mythology in their speculative universes. However, you see a shift in the late 20th and the 21st century, early 21st century, where you sort of move ahead with a lot of dystopian imagination, and they sort of push themselves away from these mythological universes. Now, what is interesting to notice is that authors like Sowmya Rajendran and texts like these are very prevalent in the 21st century English speculative writing, Indian speculative writing in English. And these speculative universes sort of emerge from a growing anxiety from uh, changing society post-independence that is very, very true, deeply rooted in our patriarchal injustice against gender equality, right? So our independence happened in the 19, I can't seem to move. Oh, here, sorry. So the 1947 is when India got independence. And when we revisit after like 70 years, revisiting the notions of female subjectivity in politics, Rajendran's narrative sort of explores the idea of the women as a subject and a subjectivity in a dystopian setting, which is culturally very, very rooted in the Indian form. And at the same time, the text sort of evolves itself as a form of social and cultural criticism. And by exploring the politics of female subjectivity through speculative fiction, like, futuristic tools and bioviolence, we look at possibilities of resistance and rebellion made available to and explored by these female protagonists. So we sort of see a cultural manifestation of patriarchy within its speculative universe. For Rajendran, the novel is her way to respond to gender-based violence that we see. With respect to, I'm just going to move because I realized that it's a 10-minute presentation. So why I bring dystopian impulse here and talk about narratives like this is because the sort of utopian ideals that India had while it was getting independent, the narratives, etc. Um, I apologize. There's a lot.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I think I missed the last bit of what you said.
I'm sorry, there's a lot of background noise here. It's the evening, and there's already going on. But the whole point is that the dystopian impulse is essentially something that is explored by these writers. It's sort of like this long-drawn disillusionment by the authors women of India noticing from the independence movement sort of dimming down of the utopian value that the nationalist movement started as, and leading to something that culminated in three major ways. That was violence and representation of women by the Hindu right political parties, and the after effects of globalization on urban women, which sort of happened in the 1990s, right? And uh, this gives, in all cases of violence against women, the root becomes the unequal power structure. And after that, you have the Hindu right political parties, the BJP, who is currently ruling India at this point. I mean, they are the prime minister and the party which has won in a democratic election. They sort of project women in the traditional role of mother, daughter, and something that needs to be protected. And they cannot move beyond that role because you tie the far right political parties in India sort of tie the religion, Hindu religion, with their idea of how women are supposed to be. So that sort of creates a cause and effect relation with respect to violence of women that was already prevalent in India before and during independence and after independence. And as the 1990s progressed and we moved to liberalization of the we opened our gates to the world basically, and the sort of urbanization that hit India, women in India had to bear the brunt of this economic backlash, and the economic agency that was taken away from women in most urban and in some cases rural Indian women. And it becomes very, very clear that independent India did not follow the very utopian ideals that nationalist movement made seem achievable. Uh, Even though there were many post-women's organizations that came up, the crisis period during the 1960s and 1970s, the pace at which they were working was not really up to the mark of the kind of work that needed to be done. So it was sort of like a long history of women's satisfaction and disillusionment post-independence that gives rise to an increasing amount of dystopian fiction written by women in contemporary times. An example of this is the text that I read out, Sowmya Rajendran's The Lesson. Because Sowmya Rajendran, in an interview, she talks about the narrative premise being taken from a report in a newspaper where a judge in one of the lower courts in India had justified rape of a minor, saying that the rapist was staying away from his family. So that is actually, which is completely wrong, but it was justified as a systemic uh, wrongdoing, right? And there is no possibility of resistance. I mean, I think these dystopian novels, they basically sort of demystify, to take Katrak's term, demystify resistance, because you sort of realize the realities of how much resistance you have where you are in a state of absolute power, which is very, very reflecting or mirroring the current Indian scenario, right? I think, in conclusion, what we can take from Sowmya Rajendran's narrative and also many other authors that are writing at this point of time is, even though their texts present an exaggerated account of reality, as they mentioned by the authors themselves, they have never considered this as something that is impossible. So it serves a dual purpose. One is to present their disillusionment with gender subjectivity in Indian society, and the other is to provide opportunity for themselves and the readers to critically comment on the same. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shrishti, for your eye-opening presentation on the lesson. We're going to continue with our panel. Now, I believe we're just going to go to Ben DeVries, who is a PhD candidate in English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he'll be presenting Shit Hits the Fan When: Gendered Futures, Violence, and the Composition of Catastrophe in Parable of the Sower and Patriots.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the previous panelists. Yeah, can you hear me? Is my screen fine? Yes, no, maybe?
It works. It works.
Good to go.
Awesome. Fantastic. Okay, off to the races. In the past decade, literary critics and science fiction scholars have frequently attached Octavia Butler's post-apocalyptic novels, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, to progressive agendas. Indeed, as some in this audience can no doubt attest, these two books get recruited pretty regularly to speak to left-leaning topics: feminism, intersectionality, critiques of white supremacy and capitalism, climate change, principles of resilience, organizing and emergence, liberation, and futurity. And all of that is with very good reason. Published in 1993 and 1998, Butler's novels about a young Black woman trying to survive amid the slow apocalypse of climate chaos, neoliberal privatization, and galloping Christo-fascism feel today eerily prescient. Butler is, in Walida Imarisha's oft-quoted phrase, a writer of visionary fiction. Her success, as Gary Canavan remarked in a public books essay last year, is to be measured by, quote, the ever reappearing Twitter hashtags, hashtag Octavia knew, and hashtag Octavia tried to tell us. Still, Butler's enthusiastic reception by progressive scholars does have trade-offs. In the present case, while scholars sometimes note the parable novel's interest in survival, and maybe even their proximity to preparedness cultures like survivalism, these scholars invariably stop short of reading the parable novels alongside actual far-right survival fictions. To that point, Butler's scholarship would, I suspect, do very little to prepare readers for the minor but appreciable interest that some right-wing survivalists have taken in the parable novels. Here then is where this paper comes in. For the next 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to introduce a right-wing contemporary of Butler's parable series, a 1999 survivalist novel titled Patriots. Written by James Wesley Rawls, a prominent US survivalist and self-described constitutionalist Christian libertarian, Patriots is probably unfamiliar to many of you here. So to keep things moving, the talk will focus primarily on it, though with the aim of bringing Butler's parables into sharper focus too. In particular, I want to direct our attention to what I'm calling the composition of catastrophe, or the forms by which a story makes catastrophe narratively useful. Put differently, I'm hoping we can approach catastrophe in Patriots not as some narrative given, not as a stepping stone that we follow from here to there, but as an aesthetic and formal act. How does Patriots create its animating apocalypse? Asking this question, I wager, will give us fresh perspective on what these novels require Apocalypse to do, in terms of story, yes, but also, and especially, in terms of ideology. In keeping with the theme of the conference, gender will be how we keep those ideological stakes in view. But before turning to Patriots itself, I want to loop back to a point I previously teased. Projected here are a handful of comments and posts discussing and recommending Butler's parable books. I gathered these from Rawls's website, a popular survivalist haunt named Survival Blog, and they reflect a perspective on Butler's work that you won't often see in the scholarship. Such comments, like this one, praise Butler's inclusion of prepper characters, like her protagonist Lauren Olamina, or, in this case, Ben Coley. Others, like this one, admire Butler's attention to preparedness practices. Few seem to care, however, much for Butler's skills as a storyteller. And minus one user, who concludes the recommendation of Parable of the Sower with a mild warning about, quote, Ms. Butler's personal stance, few seem all that bothered by what most excites Butler's interpreters in and around the academy, for politics. Instead, contributors to Survival Blog largely treat the parable novels as an extended survival scenario, These stories are useful, as one commenter remarks, for gaming out what they call a slow decline situation. Following that same commenter, I would add that we can distinguish slow declines from more dramatic SHTF, or shit hits the fan scenarios. Rawls's novel falls pretty squarely in the dramatic SHTF category. Whereas in Butler's parables, a toxic mishmash of climate chaos, vitiated social services, and persistent hyperinflation result in the uncanny persistence of the pre-apocalyptic world in a post-apocalyptic story, Patriots dramatizes the abrupt end of the pre-apocalyptic. Set in the US, Patriots opens onto a global financial collapse called the crunch, which has rapid downstream consequences. Supply chains grind to a halt, government services and critical infrastructure fail. In the last gasps of so-called civil society, people turn desperate, then predatory. Foreseeing the consequences of the initial market failure, protagonist Todd Gray, his wife Mary, and a team of predominantly white Christian friends light out for the Grays' well-provisioned retreat in the rural Palouse Hills region of Idaho. There, the soon-to-be-dubbed Northwest Militia enacts all manner of far-right daring do, braving incursions from bandits, post-apocalyptic biker gangs, and in the novel's climactic confrontation, the New World Order, a world government bent on confiscating guns, nationalizing industry, and crushing freedom-loving Americans beneath its jackbooted heels. Subtle, to put it mildly, Patriots is not. But then subtle isn't something Patriots aspires to be. In fact, where the crunch is concerned, I'd argue that Patriots really can't afford subtlety in the first place. For its story of white masculine heroism and national redemption to succeed, to the extent that this story succeeds, Patriots needs to sustain the impression that Todd and his minimally multiracial cadre of survivalists have responded reasonably to the exigencies of the crunch, no matter how outrageous their behavior might appear. That impression, however, gets trickier to maintain in the case of a slow decline, such as the one Butler imagines. For example, under a slow decline, the retreat to remote Idaho starts to look not sensible, but premature, paranoid, and antisocial. Similarly, more extreme actions, like the Northwest Militia's decision to display the summarily executed bodies of two college-aged cannibal Maoists, start to seem like a lamentable concession to the realities of a nightmare, seem less like a lamentable concession to the realities of a nightmarish new world, and more like a ghoulishly gratuitous anti-communist pop-off. In brief, for Patriots, a world that has not convincingly ended is one that might retain its moral yardstick. And that, in a story that longs for the masculine melodrama of good guys, bad guys, and innocent sheeple, but also wants the good guys to mow down foreign nationals and blow up tanks, that would be intolerable. It's here, then, that the composition of Catastrophe becomes relevant. Like a performer in a high-wire act, Patriots stands suspended between its desire for exciting survival scenarios and a competing desire for political, ethical, and moral clarity. And while Patriots has many strategies for maintaining its poise on that stretched taut wire, its composition of the crunch remains the primary balance pole. This projected passage, which is excerpted from a longer description of the crunch, provides an illustration of how Rawls constructs the crunch. And if we had time, I'd read it aloud, and then maybe we'd do a little close reading together, but fortunately, we don't have that time. And I say fortunately because the passage is witheringly dull. Still, that withering dullness has a point. Detailing some of the financial decisions that precipitate the crunch, this extract is of a piece with the larger composition of Catastrophe. Here, between financial jargon and a pedant's regard for fictional monetary policy, the quotation performs a conspicuous kind of expertise. Moreover, the passage's narrator is non-focalized. That is, the narrator and the narrator's expertise isn't obviously attached to a diegetic character. And that's true here and elsewhere within the composition. Dipping in and out of character focalization as the fancy strikes, the narrator remains, for the most part, external to the crunch, above and outside the action. The result of this lengthy, depersonalized, and often highly technical composition of catastrophe is thus to give the crunch a kind of pseudo-objectivity. Whereas catastrophe in Butler's work gets mediated by Lauren, a first-person narrator whose diaries are a record of how the circumstances, class, geography, race, gender, and sexuality influence and particularize experiences of disaster, Rawls's crunch is pure event. It crashes into Rawls's story world as a resounding universal, an apocalypse capable of inaugurating the clean break that Patriots needs. A clean break between before and after, pre and post. A clean break, that is, between a world that seems, at least from the view of Patriots, hostile to white patriarchal power and violence, and moving into a world that positively craves patriarchy and makes a virtue of it. I'll conclude with two quick thoughts. The first is to encourage what I couldn't really do here, to pursue a more rigorous comparison of Butler's parable novels and far-right fiction. There is obviously much that makes these texts different, but as competing responses to phenomena like deindustrialization in the US, carceral expansion, and neoliberal disinvestment, their comparison also has much to teach. The second thought is to stress again the utility of reading Catastrophe as a unit of literary and aesthetic analysis. Often, I think scholars of speculative and apocalyptic fiction can be a bit like survivalists. They take a story's animating crisis for granted so that they can get on to more exciting business. Treating Catastrophe as an aesthetic act, however, allows us to defamiliarize it, to refuse to take it for granted. In this way, analyses of catastrophe give us an opportunity to poke around at what disaster stories assume about the world, and to prod the fantasies, and especially in this case, the gendered fantasies that those stories look to cohere. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all of our panelists on for this session. We have a few minutes left for questions. So I see that there already have been a few that were raised, and starting with Elizabeth Cruz's question concerning, I believe, I think it was about Alicia's presentation, or no, I believe it was about Shrishti's presentation on the lesson. When this all came up, were women judged for finding an interest in this topic and going out and reading about it? Although I suppose either of you could speak to the respective social historical contexts in which the texts you discussed were published, and what the response was, if any, from the female reading public.
Sorry, I can't see the question. I can see one from July.
Oh, it was just about the response from women readers to the book, and whether that response was attracted criticism or not.
I think criticism, not as much. I feel like it's far too new to be discussed. I mean, at this point, it's more promotion than something that is taken as a subject of study. This also came up as one of my random reading list suggestions, and with this wonderful write since then. But I think it's not reached on the subject. It's a possibility of it. I don't think at all from within the previous discussion, because as someone of women who identify with the women in India. It's the narrative is very, very painfully militating to the society reality that we are living in. And it's I mean, it is exaggerated, sure, but that is also a marker of privilege. And I am someone who is from a privileged background who may not be going through all the things that has been talked about, narrative, but do I not have any personal history with it? Do I identify with it as a woman? Yes. It may be more loudly spoken for women who are not from the privileged background. So positive response, definitely. I mean, so whether in any book reading club that has been introduced, has always been a discussion on how painfully real everything is, or the possibility of how it may be real in the future, given the fact that one of the points that I pointed out to Kaya from the party, it's the reality that in the subcontinent, right? And it's been almost 8 years, about to be 10 years, elections 2024, but we know for the way that the party is sort of dismissing and diminishing the opposition, there's no way that they get replaced. So, for all we know as subjects living as women in India, it's a repetition of the reality that there are 5 more years.
Great, thank you. Alicia, I don't know if you have any thoughts or anything to share about the reader response that the text that you were writing about elicited.
Yeah, so there's not a lot of evidence of the response to this particular novel. I think since it was self-published, it didn't have a very wide readership. And there's not really evidence that the society that she was trying to start ever got off the ground. But I know from other writers of the time, a lot of her ideas like the professionalized childcare and children living outside of the home were kind of definitely a minority perspective of the time, but there were others who were exploring those possibilities because they saw, that there was just too much for women to do to be able to really explore other possibilities outside of the home. So kind of thinking about possible alternative scenarios. So I think there were some women who agreed with her, some people who agreed with her, but most, it seems, were either interested in just changing their individual lives and the way that they lived, or looking at political changes. And there weren't as many who were interested in this kind of alternative community building like Fry was.
Got it. Thank you so much. Just want to go through a few more responses that you can see in the webinar chat. There's one that draws attention to the conflict between male Chicanos and Chicana feminists during the 60s and 70s, which was characterized by this kind of paternalistic approach by Chicanos who saw themselves as macho protector owners of Chicano women. That was the impetus for the writings of Anzaldúa and Cherry Moraga. So I guess that's more an observation highlighting parallels there. Joanne Orovec asks whether there's a danger that some people will read the lesson so as to enjoy violence against women in a pornographic way. I guess I can combine that with this question that Lee has, which I'll let her ask it because I believe that she has her hand up, but I think it's about trauma. Lee, are you able to speak?
Sure. Yeah, I can ask it. Thank you so much, everyone. Really amazing. So many thoughts, but I sorry, I'm not saying this or asking this in necessarily the clearest way, Ben. But I'm just thinking a lot. I mean, I have an interest in trauma and trauma studies in my own work, but I reread Parable not long ago. or I'm still rereading it actually. And I'm just curious about, and it's just so fascinating because I also see these connections, especially sort of with this focus. I was always fascinated by the books about plants. I'm very interested in that myself, and sort of anyway. So what about trauma? I mean, is there a space for that? Is it, especially thinking about the focus on Lauren as this empath in the survivalist? Is there no space? I mean, how do we reconcile catastrophe and trauma? Just obviously there's connections, but what would we do with that, I guess, here in your reading,
So-
especially of catastrophe? Yeah.
That's great. I think this will have to be the last question, but we can combine
Sorry.
it with Shrishti and Ben's. And maybe the question, if you could both speak to the depiction of trauma in your respective text, because I think that encompasses this question about whether it invites enjoyment of the trauma that is depicted of violence against women. So maybe Ben first, and then Shrishti.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. That's a very generous question and really generative. I think my initial inclination is to try and think of trauma maybe in two different modes. So one is like the level of literary representation. So in this case, we could talk about Lauren as an empath who feels intimately the trauma of other people. And that's pretty different. I know that Chris, a little further down, is asking about these sort of this other trajectory of far right masculinist survival fiction. Trauma there is generally something to be avoided, except when it's enacted willingly by men and subjecting themselves to sort of gunfire or hardship, which is a very different kind of sort of emotional trauma that I think you're talking about and that you're pointing to with Lauren. So on the one hand, there's the sort of representations of trauma. And I would be curious, like the thing that would interest me especially would not to be take the representational route, but to try and think about how trauma might get encoded into or mediated at the level of form instead of just representation. And because I'm not super familiar with trauma literature, I don't know that I would have a lot more to say beyond that, other than to like affirm that this sounds like a really interesting series of questions to pursue.
And even sorry to interrupt, but just really quickly, even to think about like how does it get elided, how is it avoided in some of these because it's there, right? If you talk about catastrophe, there is this anyway. Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic, because that's one way that we could start to think about forward, like where is the novel trying to elide or look away from or cover over these sort of traumatic encounters.
Yeah.
To respond to the question, also, I just want to point out that's a really, really interesting point of view. I don't think I thought of it this way, because as a reader who sort of identifies to the sort of violence that is propagated in the novel, there's no space for me to think about whether it can also invite violence against women in a pornographic way. But I would have to disagree, because if you would read the novel, I think because the author is also taking it from a very real life instance and basing the narrative around it, she makes it very painfully clear that even though the omniscient narrator doesn't side with the victim in this case, but as an author, you see her intentions very, very clear, that there's no scope for you to sort of make it voyeuristic in nature, because she satirizes that intent by sort of putting this entire television show and sort of putting this very public act of the defamation of a woman. And I think for trauma, I'm not really well versed with trauma literature, but the point is that in the narrative itself, there is no scope for the subject to process the trauma, because she's given no space. But for the readers, it's a very, very intelligent way to connect with it. I think that's one of the ways that the dystopian novels that are rising up at like 21st century in English sort of connect with the readers who identify as women, and even readers who are aware as male with respect to whatever is going on around them. So that's one of the ways that the readers connect to the text. But do the subject or the protagonist in the text have that opportunity? No. And I think that is intentional.
Thank you. And thank you so much to everybody for your insights on these texts. It's been a very illuminating session. So we've reached the end of this session, and we are going to take another break, and we'll be back, sorry, I believe at 11:15.
No, we're actually
sorry.
Gonna start the next panel right now. So I'm going to demote everyone back to attendee and then promote everyone on the next panel. Thank you, everybody.
Great,
Thank you
thanks.
for having us. Thank you. Bye.